The sky went wrong at 4:47 in the morning. Mara Vasquez knew the exact time because she'd been awake for 3 hours already. Sitting on the hood of her dead pickup truck on the shoulder of Route 9, watching the stars and thinking about nothing in particular. She had a thermos of cold coffee and a busted alternator and the specific brand of peaceful that comes from being completely stranded somewhere with no one to call. Then the sky went wrong. It started as a low vibration, not sound exactly, more like pressure. Like the air itself was being pressed from both sides. The stars in the western quadrant began to blur, not with clouds but with something else, something that moved with deliberate geometry. Then the lights came on, not like sunrise, not like anything with a name. 3 beams, vertical, impossibly white, dropped from something she couldn't see into the valley below the ridge. The sound followed half a second later, a low harmonic pulse that she felt in her back teeth. Then the valley lit up orange and she heard the screaming, not voices, not yet, machinery. The death rattle of a gas station, a diner, 2 grain silos, and probably the livestock in the lowland farms, all of it at once, compressed into a single long mechanical shriek that died as suddenly as it began. Then silence. Mara sat on her truck hood and did not move for a long time. She was 34 years old. She had been a paramedic for 9 years, had seen car accidents and drownings and one spectacularly unlucky incident involving a tractor and a fence post. She knew what shock felt like from the outside, and she recognized it now from the inside. She made herself breathe. She made herself count the lights still moving in the sky. She counted 7 before losing track. She made herself climb off the hood, grab her medical bag from the cab, and start walking toward the ridge. The first person she found was a farmhand named Otto, sitting in a ditch with no shoes on, staring at his own hands. Otto, she said, because she recognized him from the diner on Tuesdays. He looked up. His face was the color of old paper. They took the Hendersons, he said. The big one came right over the house and it put out a light and they were gone. Mrs. Henderson was hanging laundry. How many machines, she asked. He blinked. That's a strange question. It's the right question. How many did you see? 3, he said. In this valley. But I heard more. Southeast too. She helped him up. They walked. By the time the sun came up, she had collected 11 more people from the road and from the fields and from the crushed remains of a farmhouse that looked like a giant had stepped on it from above. 11 people of varying ages, varying levels of shock, varying levels of usefulness. A veterinarian named Carla who had the presence of mind to grab her whole medical bag before running. 2 brothers, teenagers, stocky, farm-built, named Deke and Pell who had already decided, with the particular calm determination of people raised to fix things, that whatever was happening was fixable. An ex-Army logistics sergeant named Briggs who said almost nothing but whose eyes never stopped moving, cataloging, measuring distance and angle and cover. And a man named Roger, middle-aged, soft around the middle, who had been a meteorologist at a regional weather station before the station had been the first thing to go. Roger kept saying he needed to get to a radio. Just a radio, any radio. They found shelter in a cement grain storage facility 3 miles east of the main road, thick walls, underground access. No windows at the upper level. Briggs picked it. Nobody argued. We need to know what we're dealing with, Briggs said, when they'd settled the worst of the injured and done a count. 14 people total, 14 survivors from 2 townships in the first 6 hours. Anybody get a good look at one of the machines? Silence. I did, said Mara. They all looked at her. She'd seen one clearly on her walk in. Not a close look, maybe a half mile. But the light was good by then, and she had steady hands and a habit of looking at hard things directly. It was tall. It moved on 4 limbs, but the limbs weren't legs. Not exactly. They were articulated in the wrong places, like something designed by someone who had seen diagrams of legs but never a living one. The body sat high and wide, a central mass roughly oval, with structures extending from it that she couldn't identify. It moved with a kind of horrible efficiency, no wasted motion. Each step placed like a calculation. No visible weapons, she said. The beam comes from the underside of the central mass. Whatever it is, it doesn't kill, it collects. Collects, the veterinarian, Carla repeated. Hendersons are gone, Otto said quietly. Not dead. Gone collects, Mara said again, because it was the accurate word and accurate words mattered. Briggs was quiet for a long time. Then, that's worse. Nobody disagreed. Roger found a radio on the second day. An old CB unit in the maintenance shed. The kind that truckers used to use before everything went satellite. He got it working with electrical tape and creative cursing, and they spent 4 hours scanning frequencies. What they found was both better and worse than nothing. Better because they weren't alone. There were other survivor groups broadcasting, scattered, frightened, but alive. Worse because the picture that assembled itself from those fragmented transmissions was enormous. It wasn't a local phenomenon. It wasn't even a regional one. The whole eastern seaboard, Roger said, not quite believing the words coming out of his own mouth. I'm getting signals from groups in Georgia, in Maine, in Ohio. There's a guy I think that's a Canadian frequency. He says the cities went first. Toronto, Chicago, New York. The machines went for population density. Of course they did, Briggs said. Military response? Some, early, nothing since. Roger took off his glasses and polished them with his shirt, a nervous habit. There was an Air Force frequency for about 6 hours. Then it went quiet. The room went quiet, too. Deke, the old brothers, maybe 17, said, so what do we do? It wasn't a rhetorical question. He was looking at Mara. She didn't know when she had become the person people looked to. It had happened without announcement, sometime in the first night. Maybe because she was the first one who had walked toward the destruction instead of away from it. Maybe because she had not cried. She had wanted to. She had gone to the back of the grain storage facility at one point and sat with her back against the cold concrete and felt the full weight of the night's events press down on her until her chest hurt. And then she had stood up and gone back to the others. She was not extraordinary. That was the thing she kept thinking in the quiet moments. She was not a soldier or a scientist or a person with any particular talent for survival. She was a paramedic from a small town who had once won in a county fair pie competition and was pretty good at fixing old engines. She did not know how to save the world. She was beginning to suspect that nobody did, and that it was going to have to be saved anyway. We find more survivors, she said. We find out if the machines have a pattern, and we find out what happens to the people they collect. How do we find that out? Carla asked. Someone goes close enough to watch. Another silence. I'll go, said Briggs. I'm coming with you, said Mara. They left at dusk. The machines seemed to be less active at night. Not inactive, but slower, more deliberate, as if they were processing what they'd gathered during the day. Briggs had theorized they might be operating on something like a thermal visual spectrum, and that the cooler nighttime temperatures reduced their ability to distinguish individual targets. It was a theory. They moved on it because they had no better one. The valley below the ridge was transformed. What had been ordinary farmland, flat fields, fence posts, a water tower in the middle distance, was now a landscape from a nightmare, and not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind. The machines had been methodical. Structures were not destroyed so much as stripped, broken down with the same efficient geometry with which they moved. The materials sorted into piles that made no immediate sense. As if they were cataloging the human world, the same way humans might catalog a newly discovered species. Mara found that more frightening than the burning would have been. They found the collection site 2 hours into their walk. It was a depression in the earth, a natural bowl in the land about the size of 2 football fields, and in it were people. Hundreds of them, maybe more, standing or sitting, silent, upright, alive. There was a faint luminescence above the bowl, a soft diffuse light that seemed to come from nowhere, and at the perimeter, 3 machines, motionless, their articulated limbs folded against their bodies, watching. Mara pressed herself flat against a ridge and looked down. They're not hurt, she whispered. She was close enough, barely, to see faces. They're just standing there. They look sedated, Briggs said. Chemical or neurological, the beam. It doesn't collect them physically. It suppresses them, and then the machine just herds. She watched a woman in a nightgown stand perfectly still while a child tugged at her hand. The child was not sedated. Too small, maybe. Not enough mass to be affected. The child kept pulling, and the woman kept standing there with empty eyes. Mara's hand found the ridge and gripped it hard. We can't fight those things, Briggs said. I know. Not directly, not with what we have, I know. But they don't know what we know, he said. Whatever they're doing, they're operating on an assumption. She looked at him. They think they've got us, he said. They think we're what we look like from above. Agricultural settlements. Low technology. Soft targets. He paused. They haven't met the right people yet. We're farmers and a paramedic and a weatherman. Yep, said Briggs. Underestimated by a visiting species. Worst mistake you can make. He smiled in the dark. It was not a warm smile, but it was a real one, and somehow it helped. They went back and told the others what they'd seen. The telling took a long time. When it was done, Roger sat with his radio, and the veterinarian Carla sat with her hands wrapped around a tin mug, and nobody spoke for a while. Then Deke said, the machines, they fold up when they stop moving. Yes, said Mara. What do they fold around? There's got to be a center. A drive point, like an engine. She looked at him. I used to strip engines with my dad, he said, slightly defensive. Everything folds around something. Something that has to be solid, has to be cooled or contained. He looked at his brother. We could find it. We don't have the tools to breach alien machinery, Briggs said. What do we have? The question landed in the room and stayed there. Briggs answered it slowly, like a man reading off an internal inventory. They had a cement building with thick walls. They had a CB radio. They had 3 hunting rifles, and a shotgun, and a pistol that Carla had pulled from her glove compartment and was embarrassed about but had brought anyway. They had a farm truck that still ran. They had a generator. They had in the maintenance shed 200 feet of industrial chain, 4 compressed gas cylinders, a cutting torch, and 17 gallons of diesel fuel. They had a veterinarian who knew chemical sedation, a logistics sergeant who had spent 8 years thinking about supply chains and weak points, 2 teenagers who could strip a farm engine blindfolded, a meteorologist who could read atmospheric pressure and wind patterns, a former farmhand who had grown up hunting, and a paramedic who had spent 9 years staying calm while things went wrong. Mara looked at all of it, the people, the materials, the tools, and felt something shift inside her. Not optimism, not confidence. Something harder than either of those, recognition. She had seen something in that bowl. The child in the nightgown, pulling at her mother's hand. Pulling and pulling, not giving up. Not understanding the concept of surrender because nobody had taught it to her yet. There was a design in the machine's pattern that Roger helped her understand on the 3rd night, when he spread his weather maps on the floor and overlaid them with the locations of known collection sites gathered from radio contacts. The machines moved in grid sweeps, systematic, covering ground in concentric arcs from their landing points. They were thorough but not fast. They were assuming no organized resistance because so far there had been none. They're going to sweep this grid in 2 days, Roger said, tapping the map. This valley, this facility. Then we have 2 days, said Mara. The plan that emerged over the next 36 hours was the kind of plan that only exists in the space between necessity and desperation, the kind that is simultaneously absurd and inevitable. It borrowed from Briggs' understanding of ambush geometry, from Deke and Pell's mechanical intuition, from Roger's reading of wind and weather, from Carla's knowledge of chemical agents and their dispersion. It borrowed from Mara's 9 years of keeping things from falling apart. It was not a military plan. It was a mechanic's plan, a farmer's plan, a paramedic's plan. The 2 compressed gas cylinders were repurposed. Carla's supply of ketamine, kept for large animal sedation, present in volumes that would have seemed excessive a week ago, was dissolved and loaded into a dispersal mechanism that Pell built from irrigation piping and a modified pump. The chain was cut and shaped. The cutting torch was tested and held in reserve. They practiced. They ran it twice in the hours before dawn, walking through positions in the dark with no lights, learning the timing by feel. Nobody slept. On the morning of the 4th day since the sky went wrong, Mara stood in the center of the prepared site and felt the vibration through her boots before she heard anything. The machine was 3 ridges east and moving this way on its grid sweep, inexorable and unhurried. Through binoculars she could see it clearly now, taller than she'd remembered, maybe 50 feet at the central mass, moving with that awful mechanical grace, each step a calculation. She put down the binoculars. Positions, she said. Briggs went left. Otto and the 2 brothers went to their stations. Roger stayed at the radio. He had a job that mattered but not one that required being in the field. And he had not argued about it. Carla went to the dispersal rig, crouched behind a concrete retaining wall, both hands on the pump. Mara walked out into the open field and stood there. She had not explained this part to anyone, not fully, because she hadn't been sure herself that she was going to do it. The machine's optical systems, if they had optical systems, which she was guessing based on behavior, appeared to prioritize moving targets. Individual targets, isolated from groups, drew more attention. It was observation, not certainty. She was betting on observation. The vibration grew until it was a sound, and the sound grew until it was a presence, and then the shadow fell over her, and she did not run. The machine stopped. She had counted on the curiosity. She had watched it in the bowl, the way the machines had paused occasionally over individual subjects, in ways that seemed attentive, almost scientific. She was counting on them not immediately understanding what a human standing still in a field, alone, not fleeing, represented. It was a small anomaly. Small anomalies, in her experience, made systematic things pause. The beam came on below the central mass, that soft, diffuse luminescence, aimed at her. She did not move. 30 seconds, 40. She counted silently, keeping her breathing controlled, feeling the beam on her skin like warm pressure. Her hands were cold. She noticed that with a kind of detached professional interest. Cold hands, steady pulse, 9 years of paramedic work, the body's own logic. At 47 seconds she raised her right hand and pointed, not at the machine but past it, east, toward the ridge. The machine did not understand human pointing. She hadn't expected it to. What she expected, and what happened, was that the gesture caused a fractional reorientation of the machine's upper sensors. A slight turn. A moment of processing the anomaly of a limb raised toward the sky instead of attempting to flee. That fractional reorientation pointed the beam slightly away from her. She ran, not away. Left, toward the retaining wall, low and fast. And behind her she heard the machine recalibrate and begin to follow. And in her earpiece, Briggs's voice said one word, now. The compressed gas release was louder than she'd expected. The ketamine dispersal hit the air in a fine mist, caught by the wind exactly as Roger had calculated it. Northeast at 8 knots, and blew back in a dense cloud that settled around the base of the machine's 4 limbs. It did not reach the central mass. She hadn't expected it to. Machines didn't sedate. What did sedate, or rather what did confuse, disorient, compromise, was what Carla had explained at length, and Mara had barely understood but trusted completely: the biochemical operators. Inside the central mass. Whatever was running the machine wasn't purely mechanical. The beam had biological properties. The collection behavior had biological logic. Whatever lived inside that machine and directed it was in some science and it was breathing the dispersal. The machine stopped moving. Not completely, it swayed. A long, strange, slow sway, like a very tall tree in a wind that wasn't there. Its limbs made micro-adjustments, the servos cycling through movement patterns that no longer corresponded to intention. The articulated joints locked and unlocked. The beam flickered. Chain, said Mara. Deke and Pell came out from behind cover, with the cut lengths of industrial chain already in motion, working fast and without hesitation. Looping the chain around the lowest joint of the nearest limb, with the practiced speed of people who had grown up working with large, stubborn machinery. They were not trying to destroy it, they were trying to tip it. Geometry, Briggs had said. Everything balances on a point. You don't fight the weight, you change the angle. The machine swayed again. The chain went taut. Pell drove the farm truck. Old, heavy, a working vehicle with a tow hook on the rear bumper that had pulled combines out of mud for 20 years, in a long arc at full throttle, and the chain unspooled and caught and snapped tight, and the machine's compromised limb gave one terrible grinding correction before the geometry changed. It fell, not explosively, not cinematically, heavily, with a long mechanical groan, like a building deciding to stop being a building. It hit the earth and the ground shook, and Mara was knocked off her feet and lay in the dirt for a moment, staring up at the sky, which was clear and blue and looked exactly like it had always looked. Then she got up. The central mass had cracked on impact, not fully open but cracked, a seam along what had been the underside now exposed. The beam was gone. Inside the crack she could see, not clearly, not immediately, something that pulsed with a soft bioluminescent light, rhythmic, the color of deep water. She walked toward it. Briggs caught her arm. We don't know what's in there. I know, she said. But they do. She nodded at the cracked seam. Whatever's in there, they came here for us. They looked at us from their ships and decided we were worth harvesting. We were soft targets, we were low-tech, we were separated, we were afraid. She paused. Let's show them what they missed. She walked to the crack and crouched and looked in. The operator, the being, the whatever it was small. Smaller than she'd expected. It was not humanoid. It was not insectoid or reptilian in any way she had ready words for. It was compact and biological, and it was looking at her with a cluster of sensory organs that she recognized, not because she had seen them before, but because of what they were doing. They were focusing. They were paying attention. It was afraid. She had not expected that. She had expected something cold, something beyond emotion, something for which fear was not a relevant state. This was not that. This was a living thing in a broken machine on a strange world, and it was afraid, and that changed something in her chest in a way she could not fully articulate. She sat down cross-legged in the dirt in front of the crack. She was aware of how ridiculous this was. She was aware that Briggs had his rifle, and that the others were watching, and that 300 yards to the north, there were 2 more machines on grid sweep, who had not yet noticed their companion had gone down. She sat down anyway. She did not touch the thing inside. She did not speak. She had nothing to say that it could hear. She simply sat and kept her hands visible and let it look at her. Let it understand, or try to understand, what a human being looked like when it was not running. It watched her for a long time. Then one of its limbs, thin, articulated, ending in something like fingers and something like antennas simultaneously, extended toward the crack, slowly, with the specific care of something uncertain of its welcome. She did not move away. Briggs made a sound behind her. She held up one hand without turning. The limb reached the edge of the crack and stopped. The bioluminescence inside the machine shifted color. Blue to something warmer, something toward orange. She didn't know what that meant. She was a paramedic from a small town who had won a pie competition, and she did not have the vocabulary or the science for what was happening. But she recognized, with the part of her that had spent 9 years in the back of an ambulance with frightened people, what an opening looked like. What a moment of contact looked like. She touched the tip of her finger to the tip of the limb. Cold, dry, slightly textured like fine-grained wood. The machine shuddered. Not violence, it was already down, already cracked. The shudder was something else. The bioluminescence went to deep amber and stayed there. And then the collection bowl in the valley below released. They found out later, from Roger's radio contacts, piecing together fragmented reports, that it had happened at all the collection sites within a 100-kilometer radius simultaneously. The people in the bowls simply walked out. No pursuit, no correction. The machines, standing guard, just stopped, stood still with their limbs folded and their beams off and their sensors dark. They never found out if it was a signal the operator sent, or just the absence of one. Whether it was communication or surrender, or something else entirely, some concept that existed in that species, and not in any human language. It didn't matter in the end to the people walking out of the bowls into the morning. Mrs. Henderson found her husband 2 miles east of where she'd been taken. She was still wearing her house shoes. Over the weeks that followed, the pattern became clear, and the pattern was not what anyone had expected. The machines were pulling back, not fleeing, too orderly for that, too deliberate, retreating, regrouping, withdrawing their collection operations in the regions where resistance had been met, concentrating in areas where there had been none. The withdrawal was not complete, and it was not fast, and it did not mean the war was over, because it wasn't, and the coming months would be long and hard in ways that Mara had not yet imagined. But something had shifted. She was sitting outside the grain storage facility on the 8th morning, drinking the last of the real coffee, watching the sky, when Briggs came and sat beside her. He had that cataloging look he always had, eyes moving across the horizon. 6 more groups made contact overnight, he said. One's a National Guard unit out of Bethlehem. Actually has weapons and training. Good. Still want the weatherman running communications? Roger's the best radio operator I've seen. Yes. Briggs was quiet for a moment. You know what I've been trying to figure out, he said. What they thought they were coming here for. What they saw from up there that made them think we were the easy ones. Mara thought about it. About the machines moving on their grid sweeps, efficient and mathematical. About the collection bowls, the systematic stripping of structures, the sorting of materials. About the look of a species running an operation they expected to go smoothly. They saw the farms, she said. They saw the spread-out settlements. They saw no organized military response. They ran a calculation, and they got us wrong. They got us completely wrong, she agreed. They saw soft targets and they found. She stopped, thinking of Deke and his stripped engines, Carla, and her large animal sedation, Roger reading the wind, Pell driving a farm truck at full throttle into the leg of a machine that had come from the stars. She thought about Otto and his hunting rifles and the teenagers, who did not know how to give up, and a logistics sergeant who couldn't stop measuring angles even when there was nothing to measure. She thought about the child in the nightgown, pulling at her mother's hand. They found us, she said. Briggs made a sound that was almost a laugh. The coffee was gone. She turned the empty thermos in her hands. Somewhere to the south, a machine was still moving on its sweep, and they would need to be ready for it, and the day was going to be long. In the facility behind her, Roger was already on the radio, and Carla was taking an inventory of medical supplies, and Deke and Pell were doing something noisy and productive with the farm truck. She stood up. 14 people in a cement grain storage facility with 3 hunting rifles, a veterinarian's bag, and a chain. In 2 days, they had done something that coordinated military responses had failed to do in the first 72 hours of the invasion. Not because they were better equipped, or better trained, or braver in some extraordinary sense. but because they were entirely themselves. Stubborn, practical, adaptable, and congenitally unwilling to accept the premise that the problem in front of them was unsolvable. She had touched the tip of her finger to a being from another world and felt dry, cool, finely grained skin, and it had been afraid, and she had sat still, and something had changed. She didn't know if it was hope or just information. She was beginning to think those might be the same thing. She put the thermos on the ground and walked back into the facility and said, "All right, what do we know and what do we need to know?" And the room answered her, because it always did now, because that was who they had become together in the space of 8 terrible days. The machines on the southern sweep would be here by afternoon. They had work to do. The network grew. That was the thing that nobody in the invasion's planning. Whatever that planning had looked like, whoever had done it, on whatever world or in whatever void between worlds, seemed to have accounted for. Not the resistance exactly, the connection. Within 3 weeks, Rogers CB had been supplemented by a jury-rigged relay system that one of the contact-ed groups, 2 electrical engineers from a university research station, had assembled from salvaged parts. The relay reached across 4 states. The voices on it were farmers and nurses, and one retired marine biologist who turned out to have profoundly useful knowledge about biological adaptation to chemical agents, were a former air traffic controller in Ohio who still had access to a working transponder and had begun tracking machine movement patterns with the obsessive precision of someone who had spent 20 years managing airspace, were a high school chemistry teacher in Vermont who had on the 3rd day produced a compound that interfered with the machine's beam coherence, reducing its range by roughly 60% in tests, were a 12-year-old girl in North Carolina who had somehow, without any explanation she could offer, taught herself to read the machine's movement cycles based on ground vibration alone, and who had begun teaching the skill to others. None of them were soldiers. Most of them were not even that brave, in any conventional sense. They were frightened and exhausted, and they missed the people who were gone, and they stayed up too late running scenarios and argued strategy with the specific passion of people who had nothing else left to care about except the problem in front of them. They were very, very human. Mara moved between groups, not because anyone had made her a commander. That word didn't fit. The structure wasn't military enough for it. But because she was good at arriving somewhere and seeing clearly what was needed and what was possible, and because she had the specific authority of someone who had visibly refused to run, she went to Ohio, where the air traffic controller had built something remarkable in an abandoned radar station. She went to Vermont, where the chemistry teacher had a list of compounds written on a whiteboard in handwriting, so small you had to stand inches away to read it. She went to North Carolina, where she sat with the 12-year-old girl for 2 hours and listened to her describe the frequency with the quiet authority of a child who has discovered they know something the adults don't. She went to a dozen collected survivors in a burned-out shopping mall in Pennsylvania and sat with them while they cried, because that mattered too. Because the HFY, the humanity, the stubborn impossible fact of it, wasn't only the engineering and the resistance and the plans that worked, it was also the grief. The grief was part of it. You couldn't have the stubbornness without the thing you were stubborn for. 6 weeks after the sky went wrong, the machine's retreat became unambiguous. The collection bowls were empty. The grid sweeps had narrowed to a retreating perimeter that Roger and the air traffic controller were now able to project with reasonable confidence. 3 of the original landing sites had gone dark. Whatever the machines had come to harvest, they had not gotten enough of it to sustain the operation, and they were pulling back. On the 41st day, the first machine left the atmosphere. Mara was on a hillside in Kentucky when it happened, watching through binoculars as a machine that had been motionless for 6 days simply unfolded its limbs, oriented toward the sky, and rose. Slowly, without drama, just left. She watched it go until it was a dot, and then not even that. She thought about the being in the cracked central mass, the touch of its limb, the color shift in the bioluminescence. She thought about what it had gone home to say, what report it would file with whatever accounted for authority in its civilization, what the word was in its language for what had happened here. She hoped there was a word for surprised. She hoped there was a word for misjudged. She sat on the hillside for a long time after the machine was gone, and she felt all of it once, the exhaustion and the loss and the 41 days and the thermos of cold coffee in the ditch and the child in the nightgown and the dry, cool skin of a hand from another world and the sound of Roger's voice cracking through static saying, "There are people on this channel. There are people everywhere on this channel. We're not alone. We are not alone," she cried. She let herself do that, finally on a Kentucky hillside with the sky above her looking exactly like it always had. Then she got up and called back to the facility, because there were still machines on the withdrawal line, and the people in their path still needed warning. And she still knew how to stay calm when things were going wrong. And the work was not done. It was never done. That was the thing about humans. They didn't stop. They hadn't been built to stop. And the machines that had come from the stars looking for something to harvest had found, in the end, that what was down here, the stubborn, grieving, adaptable, finger-pointing, chain-swinging, cold coffee-drinking, hill-sitting, child-protecting thing that was down here, was not what they'd calculated. Not soft, not easy, not finished, just human, which it turned out was exactly enough.